Hey guys, Chris with Nichols Retirement Empire. Today we are doing part 2 of the series, Are Children Safe at School? There's going to be several videos, as I told you, in this series having to do with your children's safety at school. Today I'm going to look at a topic called restraint. It has to do with restraining students, like physically restraining students or impeding students in some kind of way. And you might, well, what does that have to do with my child? How does that make them safe or unsafe at school? In the past, the reason this is such a big issue now is that you may have had students in the past in different states, in different schools, that had like some kind of severe emotional issues, or were physically violent, or maybe didn't have control of their bodies, due to certain handicaps, that kind of thing. And some states restrained those students in ways that were unnecessary. Maybe they hurt the students. Maybe they kept them, tied down all day. They engaged in restraint practices that were unreasonable and were harmful to students. What happens, anytime lawsuits occur over stuff like that, you end up with some kind of federal guidelines that are supposed to help schools know how to safely and legally restrain students. Anytime the federal government gets involved in situations like that, sometimes the way they write the laws can be very vague, or because they wrote them a certain way, it can have unintended consequences when they are practically, when they are put into practice. And these guidelines basically tell you that you have to have a safe way to do it. You have to have a time limit. You have to have training, for the people that are going to do it. Some states take those guidelines and they kind of do the, let's present, the training to all of our teachers in the state, and let's kind of follow the idea of, what would a reasonable person do in any given situation as far as restraining a student. And as long as you are doing what a reasonable person would do, then, you have, done what is legal. Some states take them a lot more literally, and they also read into them more than what they say. And there are some states that have gotten to the point where they don't practice any restraint at all. And part of it is because of the federal government, the Civil Liberties Union, the Office of Civil Rights, and all that kind of stuff. Part of it is because you have parents if anybody ever touches my child, they're getting sued, and you got to deal with that. Now, if that is the case in your child's school or your child's school system, you need to know that, because it has a big impact on how safe your child is. The system that I was in last, they were very, they wanted everybody to be trained in restraint that dealt with, certain special needs students, because those were the ones that the law typically was concerned about restraining them in a proper way, in a way that wouldn't hurt them, that kind of thing. So, the administrators and the special ed people would be trained in how to restrain those students. And then, as far as the other students go, it was more of the what would a reasonable person do circumstance. Now, applying that is sometimes kind of a gray area, but generally, as long as you could give some kind of statement of, I did it, because this. Like, for example, you got two students in a fight. One student is on top of the other student. They got their knees on their arms. they're pinned down to the ground and they're starting to punch them in the face. What would a reasonable person do? Whatever it took to get that student to stop before they seriously hurt that other student. That would be reasonable, okay? And I have to step in and stop it. That's reasonable. You would err on the side of caution, obviously, if you're a reasonable person. Knowing how litigious society is today, you would err on the side of caution. But there have been many times that I have had to restrain, grab, stop, reroute students for a very good reason, and it was legally okay for me to do that. There were many other times where people wanted me to do things that involve restraint, and I didn't feel that I needed to do it. I could do something else and still be safe and keep the other students safe, and I would do that. If your child is in a system where there is no restraint, your child's liable to be in situations where there's one child in a classroom that routinely hits, especially in elementary, routinely hits other children, grabs other children, runs around the classroom, does all these things, and they just totally disrupt the learning environment. And if you have a system where they don't practice any kind of restraint, usually what's going to happen is they're going to leave that kid in the room and take all of the other students out until that student stops. If you are in that kind of situation, my best advice to you, if the school will do it, is get your child put in a different classroom. If you can't, just make sure that your child understands that they do have, they need to stay away from that student as much as possible. You need to ask them what the rules are about restraining students, because if they tell you that they will not restrain a child whatsoever, no matter what happens, then your child needs to be prepared what they may have to do to defend themselves against that child. And your child may get in trouble. I'm not here to tell you that. I'm just telling you that's about the only recourse you have left. You need to know what's my school's policy on that, so I know what to tell my child. And I told my children, but I made sure that my girls knew that if they were ever in a situation where there was no one to help them, and they were faced with somebody that looked like was imminently going to do something to them, this is what you do. And it was very graphic, very effective, and I made sure that they understood that I don't care what your consequences are after that. We'll deal with that. I will help you deal with that, but you do not let them hurt you or beat you or do anything to you, even if you have to hurt them. That was, and I was a school administrator. I knew the risk that I was taking, telling my daughters that, and I tell them that to this day. You don't be a victim. So you figure out with your kids how you want to handle that. But that's what I did, because I knew, there were going to be times when the teacher wasn't there. Maybe they were in a bathroom and something happened, or there was not an adult. You cannot automatically assume that the adults are going to be able to protect your child from getting hurt or hit or whatever from another child, even if they're standing right there. I watched one video, and it was the elementary situation, and this guy, his daughter, would come home every day and tell him all the stuff that this other child was doing in class, and screaming and cussing and hitting the teacher. And she was little. She was in like first grade. And it happened day after day after day. And the dad was a state representative in this state. And he was like, why is this happening? Why is this kid in my daughter's class? So he went down to the school to complain, and he told the principal, why is this going on? My daughter, she can't sit in the classroom and learn because every day she's coming home and telling me she's hearing all these cuss words and all this stuff's going on. And the principal said, well, the reason that's going on is because the laws that y'all passed at the state legislature prevents us from doing anything to this child. He's like, what are you talking about? And she told him the law that they had passed, and he had voted on it and approved it. And he went back and looked at it, and it was one of those laws about restraint, and he had signed off on a law that he really didn't know in practice what in the world it was going to be like in a classroom. And he was on television now telling everybody that we need to change this. I'm going to do everything I can so that we can change this law about, my child can't learn in school. When it was his child, it became a big deal and it needed to be fixed because she can't learn. But they pass laws like that all the time, and they have no idea what effect it has in a classroom. And that's a good example of it. So your principal may look at you kind of weird if you ask that question, but it's a good idea to know what your school's rules are about that. They're not going to tell you how often they have to do it, but you can find out what the rules are and then use that to equip your child. Thanks for watching Nichols Retirement Empire. Is my child safe at school? Part 2.